Do you ever find a loose thread, like on the cuff of your sleeve or piece of fabric somewhere, and you start to pull it, and then you realize if you start pulling it, it's going to unravel a lot more than you intended. Sometimes pulling at a thread starts ripping the whole fabric apart, and you don't want to lose, say, your whole sleeve or the seam of your shirt. It can be sometimes scary to start pulling at a thread. But also there are times when once you start pulling, you kind of have to pull the whole thing out. And if that means that something that wasn't made properly has to be undone and then put back together in a new way, sometimes you have to. That's honestly what happens when we dare to follow in the way of Jesus. Because Jesus has his own way of taking our old assumptions about how the world works and sort of pulling at the thread. And once you go down that road with Jesus, he has it in mind to undo and then remake an awful lot about how we see the world and how we act in it. And we've been seeing it here recently on Sundays in worship as we've been hearing from the gospel Jesus describe his upside down, which is really right side up, way of being God's Messiah. We heard last Sunday Jesus sort of declare that his way of being the Christ, his way of being the Messiah isn't to be a conquering king or a new emperor or to raise up an army of peasants and take back their country for God with pitchforks or weapons or swords, but instead his way of bringing God's reign, of being God's anointed and chosen one, is self-giving love that lays itself down, that looks like loss, that looks like defeat, that goes all the way to death and out the other side in resurrection. Not crucifying his enemies, but being crucified for them. That is so unexpected and upside down from people's expectations. But Jesus doesn't stop there. That's the thing. That's like just the beginning. That's the beginning to pull at the thread. This coming Sunday, we're going to hear how Jesus now starts to get his disciples to think how if that's true, if God's way of saving the world, if God's way of reigning and ruling over all the universe, if God's way of doing things looks like the defeat and death of a cross rather than the pomp and glory of a commanding emperor, then everything about Jesus' way and Jesus' kind of community is going to look different. Jesus is going to pull at that thread further. This coming Sunday, Jesus says to his disciples again, just so we're clear, and just in case you missed me last time, I'm headed toward Jerusalem where my way of bringing about God's purposes, my way of fulfilling God's mission for me is to lay down my life, to be rejected and to be put on trial and crucified and then 3 days rise. The disciples just don't get it. But then they start arguing with each other about who's the greatest among them. And Jesus has to stop them and go, don't you understand? My whole way of doing things, God's whole way of doing things isn't interested with who's greatest or how can I make myself great at somebody else's expense. In fact, if you want to be great in God's order of things, you put yourself in the lowest place. You let yourself be last. If you want to be first, you make yourself servant of all. In other words, Jesus is creating a whole new way of being human together, where instead of everybody climbing up to the top to see who's best and who can lord it over everybody else, if you want to be a leader, you put yourself in the place of serving and caring for others, and you work side by side. You lift up those who are most vulnerable, if anything. You don't climb on top of other people or step on them. It's completely upside down, but it completely follows from a God whose way of saving the world is a cross rather than a conquering army. And to go even further then, Jesus doesn't tell his disciples only, you guys have to be first. If you want to be first, you should put yourself last. He then finds the most insignificant non-entity he can find. He finds a little child, and in the Greek and Roman Empire, in that culture, children are non-persons, right? Our culture tends to sort of sentimentalize children as cute and lovely, and everything's about the youth demographic in terms of marketing, but in the culture in which Mark wrote his gospel, children are nobodies. Children don't have power, they don't have wealth, they don't have status, they can't conquer anybody. They're nobodies until you grow up and then you can be a somebody. So Jesus finds a little child and says, whoever welcomes a little child like this, in other words, somebody who can't pay you back, somebody who has nothing to offer you, somebody who's a nobody in the world's eyes, if you welcome someone like this who can't do you any favors back, who can't restore the transaction, who can't give you something in return, if you can welcome somebody who is regarded as a nobody, that's how you welcome me. And that's in fact how you welcome the one who sent me, God, in other words. Jesus' way of doing things is so completely upside down, of course, really right side up, right? Jesus is willing, though, to pull at that thread to say not just that our Messiah goes to a cross, ooh, that's uncomfortable, but our Messiah teaches us if you want to be first, put yourself last, and in fact, welcome the ones who are labeled nobodies, that God's way of doing things puts the way up is actually to go down. The way to triumph looks like defeat. The way to life beyond the power of death goes through a cross and a borrowed grave. That's how God reigns and rules the world. And that's the kind of community God is making among us in Jesus, a different kind of community where instead of always elbowing each other out of the way and climbing to get the most prestigious spots at the top, the people who are leaders, the people who are first, I suppose, are the ones who are kneeling to wash feet, to do the menial serving work in the background. That's what leadership looks like for the Christian community. That's always going to sound scandalous to the rest of the world that is so used to thinking about whoever's most important is in the position of glory, and they're getting all the photo ops, and they're the ones who are most significant and notorious and have power and status and all that. Jesus' way of doing things, which is God's way of doing things, says real greatness looks like serving. And if you really want to be first, you put yourself in the position of last. In Jesus' order of things, the last are the first. That's how God does things. So be prepared. When we talk about this Sunday, be prepared for Jesus' way of doing things to upend all of our old priorities and all of our old understandings about how things work in the world. And be ready to be sent out into the world as a countercultural Minority Report kind of a voice. And that when everybody else is playing king of the hill and claiming about how great and important they are, we'll be people who just don't have to play that game. But we'll find ourselves with Jesus' kind of greatness, serving and loving and giving ourselves away. That's where we're headed in conversation this coming Sunday. And we invite you to be a part of it here at Community of Christ at 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning on Sundays. See you then.